conference, which is supported by the Centre for East European Language-Based Area Studies. I have to write it down as it's far too long for me to remember. Made up of a consortium of several southern English universities, not Scottish, you'll notice. Firstly, we have to thank Silvius Samovalov for taking the initiative in formulating the idea of the workshop and also doing a lot of work in actually getting it off the ground. We've come a long way since Mr. Gorbachev began his reform program. Then he was advised by one of the members of this university, Emmanuel, that the backwardness of the Soviet economy and its lacking capacity for innovation was due to its separation from the world economy. Joining the world economy and a return to its European home became a major objective of the reform movement. However, the move to open markets globally and a property-owning economy did not lead to the economic and political advances which were anticipated. The promised creative destruction of state socialism resulted in its destruction. And the 15 former republics of the USSR experienced economic decline. Russia lost the USSR's status as a major world power, and its peoples suffered an identity crisis. What the reformers overlooked was the fact that the world market system is driven economically and politically by Western powers pursuing their own geopolitical interests through market mechanisms. And it's against this background of decline into a chaotic social order that the ideas of Eurasianism and the proposed European Union have begun to take root. The political leadership under Putin has sought to find that elusive alternative to the neoliberal hegemony of the West, particularly to its political and economic practices of the United States. So the papers in this session consider Eurasianism at three levels. First is an historical, philosophical level, and this is the orientation that Ozvi Shkaratan takes in his paper. Unfortunately, he can't be with us due to his ill health, but his paper has been written. And he considers the origins and antecedents of the ideas of Eurasianism. Secondly, there's a middle level, and writers here take from the stock of these ideas and concoct different worldviews. And in doing so, they draw from the philosophical and historical literature to promote a way of interpreting the world. This applies to all general worldviews, including Christianity, liberalism, democracy, and socialism. So the ideas have a kind of plasticity, and they can be utilized in different ways, both to make policies and also to suggest forms of legitimation. So this leads to the third approach, which is at the policy level. And here politicians derive from these paradigms common sense views which not only guide policy formation but also legitimate policies. President Putin is the best known variant of this position. Well, the speakers today move between these various levels. The first session we plan to focus on the concept and its trajectory into the 21st century. Secondly, we look particularly at how it has developed in the context of European Union and the Central Asian regionalism. In the two sessions after the lunch break, we consider Eurasianism in the wider international and global context. So in this first session, we have 3 papers. Firstly, Ray Silvius, who will be speaking on Eurasianism as a political and economic project and the embedded civilizationism of the Putin-era. Ray is a lecturer in politics at the University of Winnipeg, and we're glad that he's made this journey especially for this conference. He's recently finished his PhD thesis, which is on Russian alternative understandings of the world order. The second paper will be by Peter Duncan, who is at the UCL in London and the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And his most recent book is Convergences and Divergences of Russia and East European and Eastern Europe into the 21st century. Finally, we have Richard Sakwa, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, and his latest book, his latest book is Putin and the Oligarch, singular. Test is to find out which oligarch. And this will be published in the next few months. So the format of the proceedings will be that each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we will throw the meeting open to general discussion.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank our hosts for hosting us in this event. I am thrilled to be here and to be amongst other people that appear to be interested in Eurasia. And I should say quickly, by way of introduction, I come from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, where very few people are interested in Eurasia. So this is a wonderful venue to be a part of, and I thank Dr. Lane not only for organizing this conference, but also for providing what I think was a pretty phenomenal segue into our presentations this morning. If I nod off a couple of times, it's because it's about 5 a.m. back in Winnipeg right now, but I will do my best to be somewhat articulate this morning. So, as Dr. Lane mentioned, my presentation is entitled Eurasianism as Political and Economic Project and the Embedded Civilizationalism of the Putin-era. And I'm hoping that this presentation provides for you more than what is maybe at first glance a clumsy buzzword, but actually demonstrates a very much real phenomenon that's occurring right now. I will skip over a couple of slides here, folks, for the sake of brevity. When I tested this out, I saw that it was somewhat long-winded, so please ignore that. And that means I'll skip right into my methodological and theoretical position on this matter and how I came to start thinking about Eurasianism in such a manner. I'm coming to the question by way of international political economy and by way of international relations, and by way of the work of Robert Cox, an IR scholar, whose most notable works are on what is arguably one of the fuzzier concepts that we have at our disposal, that of world order. And it is precisely this sort of notion and this fuzziness, this material and ideational project that is world order, that has me fascinated by what we might refer to as the current Eurasianist turn in Russian foreign policy and Russian statecraft. For Cox, the idea is that world orders are messy and fuzzy things comprised of military relations, economic and class relations, but for the purposes of this presentation, perhaps the most interesting thing is the ideational content in any given world order. That being the ideas that undergird attempts at hegemonic world orders or counter-hegemonic projects vis-a-vis those hegemonic projects. The idea here, folks, is that ideas do in fact matter. They matter to scholars such as myself who take very seriously the economic, class, and military dimensions of world order. And they matter precisely because they cannot be reduced in any sort of reductionist fashion to those ideas. And I think it is precisely in the context of Eurasianism that this prism gives us a certain amount of analytical weight. We can ask, how is it that these various, what I've referred to as intersubjective ideas, these ideas that bond political communities, that bond, if we are to believe the Eurasianists, entire civilizations, how is it that they become politically efficacious in the 21st century? How is it that we have a series of ideas, first expressed by the Russian nobility? How is it that they have any traction right now when trying to understand what otherwise might be referred to as rather technical processes of economic, political, and security integration? Pardon me, I'll skip that slide too. So Cox invites us to think about the intersubjective content of world order and what we might refer to as counter-world orders. And we can, I think, legitimately think of Eurasianism as a particular form of Russian counter-world order. The other sort of orientation that I have in this work that I can't elaborate on too greatly today is that there are particular political and social functionaries that articulate these ideas, and they do so as a means to legitimate very concrete political and economic projects that have regime backing. In some of my other works, I speak more at length about this notion that comes to us from Cox and originally from Antonio Gramsci. And these comprise what I've referred to as the organic intellectuals of the Russian state. So both officially political functionaries and intellectual functionaries that seek to represent Russian statecraft, seek to represent the broader transition from state socialism to some form of state capitalism, from state socialist international aspirations of hegemony to something that we might refer to as a question mark right now. The idea here is that organic intellectuals are intrinsically related to their class. They represent their class positions, and they do so in ways that often obscure their class positions. Arguably, given the very statist nature of contemporary Russian capitalism, this direct relationship is somewhat obscured, but it is no less interesting on that basis. The very basic point that I'd like to make about such organic intellectuals of the Russian state is that we can conceive of them as part of a longer-term political project since the fall of the Soviet Union at seeking to what I've referred to here as normalizing or depoliticizing Russian modernization, excising much of the contentious class conflict inherent within that tradition, and speaking from an official basis of what this modernization entails. This is the larger political task that such organic intellectuals are charged with. For present purposes, my argument is that in 2014, and in fact for much of the post-2000 period, these folks that we refer to as the organic intellectuals of the Russian state are utilizing what I've referred to as embedded civilizationalism to represent Eurasian integration projects. So if their main political and normative task was to normalize this broad transition to state socialism after the fall of the Soviet Union, currently they are incorporating various strands of the Eurasianist discourse and the Eurasianist philosophical and cultural legacy as a means to speak to Eurasian integration and as a means to critique the nature of what I focus primarily on, American neoliberal world order. How do they do that? As I alluded to before, they do that by representing Russia's international position and its international aspirations in a very particular manner. And that manner here is, as I alluded to, when we think about the broader long-term transition from state socialism and state socialist internationalist counter-hegemony, we think of this as a means of re-articulating the ethical and normative basis for international affairs and for domestic affairs. And with respects to embedded civilizationalism, my argument is that such transitions are largely purged of some of the potential social and political and economic questions that should concern us with these transitions. And international affairs are reconstituted on the basis of state-to-state relations and something that we might refer to as civilization-to-civilization relations. In so doing, and in articulating the Eurasianist project, the organic intellectuals of the Russian state class borrow heavily from the Eurasianist philosophical tradition. They do so primarily, in my estimation, to find grounds for the cultural legitimacy behind Eurasian integration projects, and basically state to the rest of the world that it is on the basis of this cultural legacy, it is on the basis of this cultural affinity with neighboring Eurasian states that they have legitimate claims to Eurasian integration. One more thing worth noting here, that in some of the more technical demonstrations of the Eurasian project, some of the more robust philosophical speculation that we find in the Eurasianists is bent towards what we might say are specifically practical or utilitarian ends in the larger project of Eurasian integration. So who are these organic intellectuals of the Russian state, and how have they in various ways set us up for this embedded civilizationalism? In the main, they are the man of the hour, the man of every hour for the last 14 years, Vladimir Putin. But my argument is that it doesn't stop there. We can look at Primakov, former foreign minister and prime minister, who sets the table for contemporary embedded civilizationalism with concepts such as multipolarity, with concepts such as pragmatic Eurasianist foreign policy orientations. And in fact, if one of the currents of today's session is that Eurasianism is endemic to the Putin-era, if it's endemic to his third term, we can actually see a larger precedent in this broader transition to some sort of constitution of Russia's international identity after the fall of the Soviet Union. Primakov is a central figure within that. We can look at Sergei Lavrov, current foreign minister, who also, as I demonstrate in my paper and in other work, uses this civilizational argument perhaps more so than any other Russian official. In so doing, we can see that civilizationalist discourse has seeped into the highest echelons of the Russian state. But in terms of the state officials, or former state officials, that are perhaps most involved in this broader shift, we can look back to Vladislav Surkov, former deputy prime minister, the longtime Grey Cardinal of the Kremlin, who, as many of you well know, is publicly responsible, at least, for taking credit for this notion of sovereign democracy. Sovereign democracy, in many respects, is civilizationalism by another way, by another means. And it's Surkov's argument that Russian statecraft is reflective of deeper cultural traditions, that contemporary Russian state initiatives have moral legitimacy in pursuing or in representing alternative national development orientations that differ from this more purely distilled form of Western neoliberalism. It's in Surkov that we find one of the more prolific contributors to this recent history of ideas that get us towards embedded civilizationalism. But they do so, each of these figures does so by reaching back into Russian history. And for me, with this historicist orientation to contemporary problems, it is particularly interesting that we can reach back into the broader Russian history of ideas and see that apparently 19th century and 20th century Russian nobility have much to contribute to our contemporary understanding of a post-hegemonic world order, at least in terms of the argument of the organic intellectuals. So I certainly don't have time here to perform an exegesis of Eurasianist works, but a couple of signposts just to mark this intellectual train. The first typology of Eurasianism is that of original Eurasianism. The group of emigre Bolshevik-era Russian scholars who leave for Europe following the Bolshevik Revolution, who in many respects have considerable affinities with the Bolsheviks with respects to their ideas of the endemic nature of Russian statecraft, but differ for obvious political reasons. We can mark the following as being representative of this school: Trubetskoy, Savitsky, Sivchinsky, and Florovsky, and two primary works that come to us in the early 1920s. Trubetskoy's Europe and Mankind, and the collected effort of the original Eurasianists, Exodus to the East. And if we look at these and other works from that period, we actually find striking resemblance to the contemporary geopolitical and geo-economic conjuncture. And it is perhaps for that reason that these ideas have a certain amount of traction in a contemporary sense. What is it that these so-called original Eurasianists are telling us? They're telling us that there is something endemic to Russia that necessitates political autocracy. And this comes by an even longer tradition inherited from the Mongol Yol and from the Mongol conquest. The argument of the original Eurasianists, and one that I argue is lying beneath the surface, if not manifest in contemporary invocations, is that Mongol political rule bequeathed upon the Russian state the notion of the autocratic state. But in fact, this autocratic state is required for preserving Russian orthodoxy and broader Eurasianist cultural integrity. This is the first argument. In making this argument, the original Eurasianists go beyond some of the 19th century divides of Russia and Europe, of Slavophiles and Westerners, to articulate an independent cultural zone comprised of more than the Russian Slavic culture, but that which is comprised of Russian Slavic, Finno-Ugric, and Turkic cultures. So we have this first notion, and one that is arguably very much well suited towards contemporary projects of Eurasian integration, that Eurasian culture under Russian state hegemony is not reducible to that of Russian Slavic culture. It is in fact a degree of complementarity between these various cultures on the Russian steppes and on the Eurasian steppes that we need to turn to. We also see much articulation about the notion that Russia has what is in fact a moral obligation to lead the broader colonial peoples at the time, beyond that of Eurasia alone, against the West in a counter-hegemonic project. We also have this notion of idiocracy, this notion that more pragmatic and utilitarian, if not democratic forms of statecraft are insufficient for Russian culture, for Eurasian culture. What is in fact required is a comprehensive idea articulated by a ruling class and safeguarded by an autocratic Russian state. So again, the idea is that such notions are not just historical dead letters, they resurface in various ways in a contemporary context. We may also refer to what I've referred to here as the broader notion of contemporary Eurasianism, comprising two facets. The first, Neo-Eurasianism, is a more philosophically, 5 minutes, philosophically robust articulation brought to us by such figures as Lev Gumilev. And I won't go into great detail here, we have the slide in front of us, but I will suggest that these more philosophically robust articulations of Eurasian cultural integrity, of subjecting cultural development to the laws of entropy and naturalistic phenomena, is again an important contribution of the broader Eurasianist canon. It comes to us by way of an understanding of ethnic groups, their intermingling, and the really sort of objectivist destiny that certain super-ethnic groups have for performing acts of world historical significance. In the case of Russia-Eurasia, for Gumilev, this is manifested in the notion that only two super ethnoi, the Russian and the Stepic, have converged on the Eurasian continent and have achieved regional hegemony due to their complementary cultural attributes. The second brand of contemporary Eurasianism, this should simply read Eurasianism, is what we might think of as being that which is very much endemic to contemporary Russian state practices. That being in the 1990s, under Primakov initially, the slow co-optation of these more philosophically robust ideas and bending them towards this so-called pragmatic instruments of statecraft. A slow tectonic turning away from the West and orienting towards the East and towards Eurasia. So we see a whole lexicon develop around what we might refer to as pragmatic Eurasianism within Russian state discourse, manifesting itself in concrete foreign policy objectives. And of course, this reaches a crescendo in the Putin-era, not only in contemporary iterations of Eurasian political, economic, and security initiatives, but in a whole host of initiatives that come to us from the beginning of the Putin-era, which I will not go into great detail here on because a number of my colleagues will expand upon this today. The point worth taking away is that in regime talk, in the organic intellectuals talk, such things are more than merely functional economic integration or political projects. They are in fact projects of political identity. And given the significance that Russian officials place on this notion of identity as being central to their political and economic initiatives, we need to look very closely at how they co-opt various strands of the larger philosophical Eurasianist tradition. We can see this at the bottom here in the quote by Putin in September of 2013, that the Eurasian Union, the most robust of all of the Eurasianist integration initiatives, is a project for maintaining the identity of nations in the historical Eurasian space in a new century and in a new world. Arguably, this turn to talks of identity is not entirely innocent. A couple of illustrative quotes that we'll turn to briefly to demonstrate this embedded civilizational phenomenon. We can see in the quote from the Valdai discussion group speech that Putin offers of a couple of things. Referring, in this case, to proto-Eurasianist Konstantin Leontiev, suggesting that, in fact, Eurasian space is best articulated and best ensured by a state civilization. Not just a state, but a state civilization. In this quote, with the heavy leaning on the Russian Orthodox component of such a state. But here's the point that I want to make. Upon invoking the legacy of Eurasianist and proto-Eurasianist philosophers, Putin and other organic intellectuals of the Russian state turn immediately to some of the more pragmatic and utilitarian orientations of Eurasianist integration. But they do so whilst also referring directly to the civilizational basis for such initiatives. I will allow you to read these rather long-winded quotes on your own time. Couple points to take away here, folks. What does this notion of embedded civilizationalism mean? It's an effort on the part of Russian officials to combine the legacy of Eurasianism with the more utilitarian and pragmatic instruments of statecraft. It is a way of sanitizing some of the more counter-systemic revisionist claims of Eurasianist philosophical orientations to that which is acceptable within contemporary parlance and discourse. And we should note, though, even though it is shorn of such philosophical excess, we can see direct invocations of the Eurasianist legacy by the highest echelons of the Russian state. Two things that embedded civilizationalism does, positive and negative, for the sake of analytical clarity. Valorizes Russian state-led Eurasian integration in the context of Russian state civilizational imperative, because of the cultural affinities of Russia and its neighbors. This is the positive project. And the flip side of that coin is the negative project, to carve out a space whereby the cultural legitimacy of Russian actions guards against the further encroachment of American hegemonic initiatives, particularly in Central Asia. In my paper, I demonstrate this phenomenon somewhat more empirically by showing the increased prevalence of Eurasianism and civilization and its cognates within foreign policy documents of the Russian state. And we'll close quickly on this quote. So again, the idea here is that civilizationalist discourse has become the latent and manifest orientation of the Russian state on many public initiatives. The foreign policy concept of 2013 states rather emblematically, echoing the 2008 version, for the first time in modern history, global competition takes place on a civilizational level, whereby various values and models of development based on the universal principles of democracy and market economy start to clash and compete against each other. Cultural and civilizational diversity of the world becomes more and more manifest. This is the end of the trajectory towards embedded civilizationalism, and I do believe I am out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I think that probably everything I say in the paper has been also said by somebody else in one of the other papers today. What distinguishes my paper, I thought, is my focus on Putin specifically. What has influenced him, what his aims are. And my paper is very close to that of Ray, so I feel I perhaps ought to somehow differentiate myself in some way from Ray. It's an excellent paper, got a lot more quotations and everything, more sources than I have in mind. By the way, somebody's keeping the time, because I'm keeping the time. How much longer have I got left? Where? Sorry? Yeah, oh, great, good, lovely. Good, so that's 11:26 I must have started. Thank you. In that, I don't really agree, I have to say. I really agree that Putin is an organic intellectual of the Russian state. My conception of the relationship with Putin and the Russian state is that he rather more is in control of the Russian state, not in the sort of absolute control, just in any sense that Stalin could be, and you can constantly complain about the bureaucracy that doesn't serve him, but I think he is rather more setting the agenda for the direction of the state than Gramsci's term of organic intellectuals really conveys. So that's my attempt to make a distinction. I also don't really believe that the Russian state, I'm not quite sure whether Ray was saying that they're organic intellectuals of the Russian state, which he said today, or whether of the Russian state class, or indeed of some sort of bourgeoisie. I rather see, and here I agree with Trotsky, so I'm not entirely running away from Marxism. Here I agree with Trotsky as rather the state is something in Russia existing above classes. In a nutshell, I don't really think that Marxism does work in Russia. I'm not sure if it works anywhere else actually, but certainly from an analytical point of view, I think it's really got its limitations. Having said that, and carved out my own position that I can. My paper begins with the article that Putin had, 4th of October 2011, where he said that, announced that what had been the customs union of Belarus, Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan would become a Eurasian economic union in 2015. Actually, your dates were a tiny bit not quite what is said by Putin. Putin and the commitment of the presidents at the moment is that the Eurasian economic union will come in 2015. And the Eurasian Union as such is something conceptually different. Putin says that the Eurasian Economic Union will develop into a Eurasian Union in the same way, he says. He draws explicit parallels with the European Union having developed from something economic, the European Gold and Steel Community, right through European Community, and then the European Economic Community, then to the European Union, seen in some respects as a political union. He makes this explicit comment, but he doesn't put forward a date for when this Eurasian Union might be achieved. He says, already in this article back in October 2011 in Vestia, that some neighbours, clearly referring to Ukraine and some others, say that they don't want to participate in such integration projects because they will contradict the European choice. But he argues that their way towards Europe is through the Eurasian Union, that the Eurasian Union will be part of greater Europe, and I quote, "unite together with the EU, united by the common values of freedom, democracy and the laws of the market." That is obviously Putin's concept of freedom, democracy and the laws of the market. So Putin by then has got quite a long way from where he was talking before about Russia being part of West European culture, as in, which he'd argued in 2000. Now clearly he's saying that the states that are going to form, what he hopes will form the Eurasian Union, are rather up political and cultural, and raise excellent words. I do agree with most of your paper, I have to say, must confess, civilizationally different. So I then talk in the paper about Eurasianist thought, and Ray's really done that much better than I would have done, so I'm going to skip that. Gumilyov I mentioned in particular as somebody who was well published at the end of the Soviet Union, very well known in the early years of the Russian Federation, so certainly somebody who would have had quite a formative influence on Putin in the 1990s. Made explicit by the fact that Putin quotes Gumilyov, as Ray has already shown us. But I think Gumilyov is in there contributing to the influences on Putin. But I do want to make this point because I want to make it explicit, really, that right from the time that Sergei Stankiewicz in 1992 brought out the idea of Eurasianism as a possible ideology to replace Marxism-Leninism for the Russian state, he was putting it forward simultaneously as an ideology both for domestic policy and for foreign policy. In other words, that Eurasianism could unite the ethnic Russian majority in the Russian Federation with the Muslim minorities, and similarly in foreign policy, within the CIS, it could unite the Russian state with and the other Slav states with the Muslim, I shouldn't say Muslim states, the states named after nationalities of traditionally Muslim culture, I think is more accurate, also in the CIS. So there was this really instrumentalist use of Eurasianism posited already in 1992, although not taken up by Yeltsin at the time. But the 2002 census, already in the Putin era, showed that there was an even greater need for some sort of unifying idea, if you don't want to call it an ideology. I think it can be called an ideology, but an idea with the continuation of the decline of the ethnic Russian population, and correspondingly with the demographic vitality of the Muslim groups, showed that an appeal simply to Russian nationalism, the Russian Orthodox Church, had no future in the Russian Federation. If you add to that the countless millions of migrant workers, Gastarbeiter, in the big Russian cities now, mainly from Muslim cultures, then again, Eurasianism has an instrumental role. The next part of the paper, I've got to finish it, I've got 6 minutes left, yes. The next part of the paper talks about putting the context to what I call Putin's Eurasian turn. And this context is, I use rather different language from David, I think. David, sorry, it's the growth of globalization, neoliberalism. I'm sure that that's an important factor. My focus, though, is more on the growth of specifically Western institutions in post-Soviet space, rather than on social and economic processes. In other words, I see Putin's turn to Eurasianism to taking elements of Eurasianism anyway, because I don't think he's a Eurasianist or neo-Eurasianist even as such. But the use of Eurasia, the use of the idea of Eurasia, I see as being related to and encouraged by what he sees as the enlargement of NATO and the European Union, specific Western institutions, into the space which was, first of all, the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and then the attempts to encroach on, from the Russian perspective, the current Russian sphere of privilege interest, to use Medvedev's words. In other words, though Medvedev didn't define it, but mainly the former Soviet republics in general, with the Baltic states still being a rather grey area in my view. So I go on through NATO enlargements, the humiliation that Russia suffered in 1999 with NATO's bombing of Serbia and Russia's incapacity to stop NATO from separating Kosovo from Yugoslavia. So Putin, like Yeltsin, began, especially from 2001 after 11 September, with a policy of trying to cooperate with the United States, but gradually becoming disillusioned as, in his perception, the United States and other Western countries were giving support to anti-Russian forces within the post-Soviet space, the key events being the coloured revolutions, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and even more so, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And we should remember that Kuchma, who more or less chose, not entirely, but who certainly supported Yanukovych to be a successor rather than the alternative Yushchenko, Kuchma had signed the Common Economic Space, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And that was why Putin was very keen that Yanukovych would get elected in 2004, because he hoped that Yanukovych would maintain Kuchma's commitment to the Common Economic Space. In other words, that Ukraine would come back into, more into the Russian sphere of economic influence in an institutional form. But as things developed in 5 minutes, oh, thank you, that's longer than I thought, thanks David. As things developed geopolitically after the colored revolutions, with Yushchenko in Ukraine, Saakashvili in Georgia expressing their desire to join NATO and the European Union. And then in February 2008, the recognition of Kosovo as a de jure independent state again reminded Russia of its own humiliation in 1999. Again, Russia could not stop that. In its own eyes, it had let down Serbia. But the Bucharest summit of 2008, when NATO promised Georgia and Ukraine membership, really alarmed the Russian leadership. They were casting around for a strategy. They're asking the institutes in Moscow, what can we do to stop Ukraine joining NATO? They were looking for a strategy. This is the use of intellectuals in Russia. As we know what happened to Georgia in the war with Georgia, which I would argue that the Russian army had provoked, but certainly undoubtedly it was Saakashvili who actually attacked Russia, which, as Napoleon and Hitler found out, is never a good idea. And the effect of that, of course, was that NATO enlargement was stymied as far as post-Soviet states were concerned. So the European Union, in my perspective, I explain in more detail, became the principal instrument of Western engagement in the post-Soviet states after that. And hence the Eastern Partnership that Yelena has written about so well, the attempts to attract 6 post-Soviet states into association agreements and more with the European Union. I then talk about the ideological context of sorry, before I move on to that, I just have to mention that, of course, the victory of Yanukovych in Ukraine was also a victory for Russia, demonstrated by the signing of the Kharkiv Accords, giving the Black Sea Fleet, Russian Black Sea Fleet, an extra 25 years, up to 2042, in Sevastopol. I then talk about the ideological context that Putin comes to use the Eurasian concept with. The fundamental concept ideologically is to form justifications for authoritarianism in the context of conservative, backward-looking elements. Soviet nostalgia, instrumentally used, although of course Putin does not call for the restoration of the Soviet Union. I then talk about various integration projects that existed before the Eurasian Union, which again Ray has dealt with very well, and I've got 2 minutes. So I just want to finish off by saying about the impact of the Eurasian Union proposal. And in my view, it was time, the proposal was made at a time, well, it clearly was made at a time, for the 2011-2012 electoral cycle. Putin just announced that he was going to come, or Medvedev exactly just announced he was going to come back as president. Already in the middle of October, middle of November, United Russia held a round table, za Soyuz, for the Union, propagandizing the idea of the Eurasian Union. But I think it's significant that when the top body of the Eurasian Customs Union and Common Economic Space met a couple of days later, that was Lukashenko, Nazarbayev and Medvedev, while they promised to strive to create the Eurasian Economic Union by 1st of January 2015, they did not mention the Eurasian Union as such at all. And that clearly reflects resistance from the other states to taking unity further from the economics into the politics. Moreover, the Eurasian Union didn't resonate with the public, who were concerned about, in Russia, who were concerned about the fear that this would lead to more immigration from Central Asia and the Caucasus. And Putin, in his article on the nationality question, published in January 2012, argues, no, don't worry, because the Eurasian Union will reduce the inequality between the states of the CIS, and therefore there'll actually be less immigration. And my final point is from the experience of the last year, of how the European Union completely failed to understand how committed Putin is, and Russia, the Russian elite more generally, is to the process of integration in post-Soviet space. They were not expecting Armenia to announce in the summer that it was going to join the customs union. And they didn't know what Yanukovych was going to do. But Putin's readiness to provide $15 billion, first of all, to threaten Ukraine, that if you do sign the association agreement, then you'll lose all sorts of trade. But then, on top of that, to promise to offer to Ukraine $15 billion if it maintains and increases its links with Russia, shows how seriously Putin does take this question of Eurasian economic integration. And my final point is that the demonstrations that we're seeing now in Kiev demonstrate the lack of democratic legitimacy of the Eurasian states, that all these regimes are undemocratic regimes, authoritarian regimes, which is what the people in Ukraine are in fact protesting about now. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. My paper is going to be both complimentary and complimentary because of two excellent papers in front of me. So I'll skip some bits. So my question is a simple one. Why Eurasian integration now? How did we get to this point after 25 odd years, nearly 25 years of independence? How can we explain the emergence of Eurasianist projects more broadly, including the intellectual ideational ones? And in particular, why is Putin, in his third term, making so keen on Eurasian integration? At first, we thought it would be the centerpiece of his third term, his big idea, certainly big idea that Izvestia article on the 4th of October in 2011 looked as if this was the big manifesto to establish this sort of to take integration in Eurasia seriously at last. So I'm going to look at this question in three particular ways. So the first one is simply to say Eurasian integration in the context of larger regional ideas, debate over regionalism, suprastate integration and so on. So the first aspect of that is simply to say that regionalism clearly is one of the big ideas of our day. So if we're saying Eurasian integration as a big idea of the 21st century, that must be seen in the context at all levels across the world, all sorts of integration projects taking on. And therefore, what Putin is doing is, quite simply, you could say, normalizing it. So there's nothing unusual about this. This is why his emphasis in his university article and in many speeches since then. So why are you all getting so upset by this? Because Eurasian integration fits quite firmly in the pattern of modern integration because of all sorts of the functional logic of economic integration. Why should you deprive us and ideologize this when we are de-ideologizing and simply saying this is a normal activity? So a type of normalization project going on to say that it makes sense economically, I'll return to that, and so on. Clearly, this plan to go, I won't go into detail of the actual Eurasian Customs Union, Eurasian Economic Union and so on, I'm sure that will be discussed later, but simply to say that this idea, of course, is the most serious attempt in post-communist Eurasia, post-Soviet space. There's lots and lots of other competing integration projects going on at the same time. So that's as it were, the political idiom of our days is to do this. Within the post-Soviet space, of course, there's the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CSTO on the security side. So a whole stack of competing integration projects, which I think we should certainly take into account. At the same time, there are all sorts of, if you like, macro-regional projects, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and indeed, I mean, if you go to China, they very certainly, I was in Shanghai for a long weekend in the autumn, and of course I'm now an expert on China, as we all know. 2 days is plenty enough, and if I'd gone by taxi I would be able to be a world-class expert. But nevertheless, those 2 days shocked me in the sense that at all levels, talking to people at the universities there, how much they wanted to be part of this macro continent Eurasian integration. Don't leave China out, they said. Make us part of it. And in fact, the argument being this is in your own interests. So all sorts of different levels of integration. So regionalism is one of the driving forces of the international economy today, at all sorts of elements. However, the starting point, of course, in post-Soviet space is very different, for example, compared to the European Union. So however much you can try to normalize it, it's not going to be normal, because clearly, after the Second World War, European Union was a peace project to transcend the logic of conflict and so on, and indeed, I would maybe return to it, Alan Millward, to say actually it was the European saving of the West European nation state after the destruction of the Second World War and so on. So a totally different logic, whereas the logic in post-Soviet space is, well, if you like, post-colonial, the attempt to establish and gain sovereignty. And so it's that logic of trying to save the nation state is quite the opposite. And so therefore, there's going to be, if you are going to normalise it, and there's no reason why not, there's all sorts of, to understand the specific context is going to make it a very different type of beast. At the same time, clearly, we see, I mean, I could talk about NAFTA in North America, Mercosur in South America, in Asia as well, all sorts of different attempts. So, bottom line, Eurasian integration of this contemporary form is only one of many contrasting and competing integration projects. One specific point on all of this, of course, is the quite fair point, is that the European Union has always been in favour of integration projects. It's all regionalism, it's been one of its big things, we've done it, you can do it as well, you can, this sort of attempted embedded, if I can use that term, embedded normativity in Manners and others, within the European Union. However, this embedded normativity, or so-called, well, whatever Manners calls it, it suddenly comes to a stop at the borders of post-Soviet Eurasia. And of course, we know that the European Union has been highly critical all the way through with all post-Soviet integration projects, and this continues now into its criticism of Eurasian Union. So this is an extraordinary phenomenon which in and of itself needs to be examined, the logic of how this denormalization of something goes on. So that's the first part of the first section. So just very briefly then, the second part of the first section is simply to say, at the idea, so that was a spatial element, regionalism. The second one is more ideational. And here we have, I don't want to go into all this Eurasianist as an idea, but nevertheless, we have, if you like, this notion of the question that I'm leaving aside the embedded Eurasianism and civilization, all of that is highly important. Just simply to say that at the ideational level, what is going on, it seems to me, with the Eurasian Union, is a very clear, I mean, putting it very straightforwardly, to say that while the Russian view would be, while we share many of the ideas of human dignity, human rights and so on, the particular matrix in which these norms are embedded in a particular culture or civilization is going to be distinctive. So this is a distinction which I think is absolutely fundamental to Russian political discourse today. That it's not opposed to the values embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on and so forth. But it is a statement to say that these take specific forms in each civilization, whereas from the Western hegemonic project is to say not only the values themselves, but the way in which they're interpreted and then applied has to be the way we do it. And that is the resistance which is actually emerging, and why Eurasianism in all of its various forms is a form of resistance to that particular form. So not to the ideas themselves, but to the cultural matrix in which they are embedded, i.e. the civilization, if I to say. So that's just simply bottom line on the ideational side, an ideological contestation. Again, keeping it very straightforward and simplifying bottom line here. Again, it is a struggle over the definition of the future. In other words, a contest over what is progressive in the modern world. With the collapse of communism and so on, all these basic ideas of progressivism, which we've been very familiar with. We knew what progress meant until about 1989. We knew it meant social amelioration, inclusion, equality, all the ideals of the French Revolution, plus the social liberalism of the 19th century and Marxist emancipatory socialism, all of those ideas. And of course, what's been going on since then is the belief that all of these were once gained, never lost. We can see them at all fronts retreat on what is progressive. And so what is actually going on at the moment is an attempt to say, to reassert, to say, look, we have a vision of our own future. It's highly contested, there's all sorts of issues going on there, but nevertheless, such like. At the same time, one of the idea that the European Union embedded this highest ideal of progress on the European continent is now challenged. And that is a major development. Because what is progressive, we don't know, but one way or another the European Union represents this, is no longer a valid statement at any front, since for various reasons, including, of course, negotiations for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is a fundamental, obviously it would embed the value, if you like, the social market ideas which we thought were defended by the European Union. In other words, the old communist critique of the early 1970s, that the European Union is only a gathering of big business and so on. Maybe there was something more to it than we suspected, or certainly Jacques Delors' idea of a social Europe has now gone. So anyway, all these are fundamental elements, I think, in the mix in trying to examine what Eurasian integration means. Or this idea of Neo-Eurasianism is about. And of course, the idea of transatlantic partnership is a repudiation of the absolutely fundamental idea, which has been at the centre of it all, this idea of pan-Europeanism, greater Europe idea, that with the end of communism, Europe would be united and be able to take control of its own destiny. And this is a vision, of course, of Mikhail Sergeyevich himself. Gaullist ideas earlier and later. Nicolas Sarkozy, of course, mentions it. Putin had mentioned it in his speech in Berlin in November 2010. A very, very detailed analysis of how a union of Europe could look like. And of course, the Valdai Club itself has come up with the idea of a union of Europe, where you have the European Union and you have Eurasian integration. And indeed, they are complementary. So when Putin says they're complementary, he's not making it up. I mean, this is coming out of a big debate which has been going on and embedded in the idea of greater Europe. So leaving that to one side. The second section I'll just be exceptionally brief about this because in many ways Peter, easy to confuse, of course. So Peter has already outlined the path, the stage posts on the way of Russia's moving away in 1998 and the Munich Security Conference and all of that. But basically, what is this new phase in Russian foreign policy? I call it neo-revisionism. You can call it what you like, but I think it's neo-revisionism. Why? Because it's neo because it doesn't ultimately repudiate the notion, the existing world order. So this, it doesn't like the hegemonic aspects of it, but it's not challenging the United Nations, it's not challenging the very structure of international order, indeed of global economic governance, IMF, World Bank, and so on. It's not genuinely neo-socialist, it's nothing like this, not that old revisionism of the Soviet empire. However, what's neo about it, what remains revisionist, is that it's unhappy with, again, the matrix in which these values and which this is embedded, including NATO, including other elements. So lots of movements and lots of elements. But I don't think we can understand Eurasian integration today without understanding this larger ideological context or the evolution, because Putin was the most pro-European leader Russia's ever had from his, we could all have dozens and dozens of quotations of his early years and how gradually he was alienated in this process. From the Iraq War, the irresponsibility, the old versus new Europe, the role of the enlargement in establishing this division. So a lot of element. So neo-revisionism doesn't try to put forward alternative norms. All it's arguing is that the way these norms are embedded in civilization and so on have to be done our way. So to end, just very briefly, the question, and this is, David is going to make this point when he's commented on it, he said, look, you don't come up with a firm conclusion, and I don't. And so I'm firmly, but I do think these questions, and maybe at the end of this day, I will be able to give a firmer answer. In other words, is Eurasian integration of this contemporary form a good idea or not? And I would put forward, there's 7 types of ways of questions which emerge immediately. In the paper there's 6, but I'll give 7. So the first one, the first one is that, before giving critiques, is that Eurasian integration simply has to be put into the context of these major geopolitical choice facing Russia today. Some of them have been outlined, but I think there's more. And each one of them continues. The whole point of Putinism, in my view, always, I've been arguing, is that it's polymorphous. It contains many, many different and incompatible and often contradictory elements. 5 choices facing Russia. The first one is to come back to West European Union integration, so that embedded to go back. And that project hasn't disappeared, as we saw in Brussels and so on. It's not gone. The second one is the China one. China, of course, the largest industrial power today already. All sorts of elements, China, the growth of trade, and so on. The China way is hugely important. And also, of course, the fact is that Russia and China will be forced closer together if the other big mega integration project, that's a Trans-Pacific Partnership, develops. And Trans-Pacific Partnership really does foreclose all sorts of options for Russia. As we know, after his recent visits, he went to Vietnam, he's gone to other places, and attempt to actually establish all sorts of links with other Asian countries. Trans-Pacific Partnership will force Russia and China together in a strange sort of way. So that's the second one. The third one is with the US, and there's an article I just saw yesterday, with the United States against China. So this would be great. This is Vladislav Inozemtsev argues this. So forget all these nonsense and so on. Go with the United States. That will give you the technology. That will give you the money. That will put you in with the hegemonic power. So that always gives you a bit of a leverage and so on. Do Britain and do France and so ally bandwagon with the dominant power. Well, there's something to be said for that. Fourthly, the Eurasian integration of what we were looking at today, and of course the fifth one, which I won't deny and I won't repudiate at this stage, and in my view the only serious one, is pan-European unification. That, in other words, we need a reboot, rethinking of pan-European integration. What form, what architecture, what institutional form it would take, we don't know. There's elements of it. We know that OSCE hasn't been a huge success at the moment. There's a Council of Europe and it's about, but nevertheless, pan-European ideas are not dead. Greater European ideas are not dead. So very, very briefly, what are the critiques of it, you could say. And I don't have time, so I'll just list them. The first one, of course, is to say that Eurasian integration is indeed a neo-imperial venture. This is a critique which is made, this is the view of Hillary Clinton in Dublin. This is a very strong idea that the whole thing is, you could say, that even if Russia, as I've suggested, it's not certainly consciously a neo-imperial project, it may become so. Because what other regional integration project has ever taken place where one state is just so enormously out of kilter with the other ones? So by definition, and of course it should be, Russian interest should take priority given the fact it's the biggest. And so that's the first critique of that all, even though, I think deeply in the Russian elite, in certain sections, there is not any appetite for this at all. I mean, I think that it just simply isn't there. The second argument is on the shortcomings of the integration process itself. Now, there will be discussion about this, but Peter said that, that in Eurasian integration a bit top-down. Well, of course, that is the Monet method. It is top-down. That is how you do it, incrementally. Elite-driven project. It ain't going to work otherwise, and absolutely like Gastarbeiters. So, I mean, who wants Eurasian integration if that's going to mean the figures are quite stark. If in the 1990s, 60% of Gastarbeiters came in from the Slavic republics, Belarus, Ukraine and Moldova, now overwhelmingly from the Central Asian republics. So, is this an attractive force? Well, I don't know. The third critique builds on whether Eurasian integration really is in Russia's state interest. And this is where Christopher Bickerton's ideas about the way that European Union is a process of state transformation. This is going to be very difficult in Eurasia if we're talking about state transformation where states are still not precisely formed, in my view. The Russian state is an endless tension between the constitutionalism and the regime element of it. Fourth critique, is by committing itself to a premature integration project that Russia actually could, it forecloses other options and indeed it may even impede its own state development. Fifthly, and this is a question, we know, we've all been reading enormous about Sergei Glazov, the arguments for economic, the actual sharp arguments for it. Now I'm going to leave that to the economists, whether it actually does. But why not? The figures are pretty good. In the first 2 years of this removal of tariffs, trade has gone up enormously. Some people I can see, well that is an issue, I'm leaving that open, maybe I have to put my foot in it. But there's questions actually whether they're economic or not. That's the fifth one. The sixth one is indeed an identity and normative issues. Indeed the question about what it means to be European at this stage, and so Eurasianism is in a sense an anti-European project by definition, and so there's all sorts of elements there, normative, there's all sorts of elements there. And seventh, which I haven't listed in the paper, and obviously it is the regime type, will Eurasian integration weaken the impetus or movement or for democracy, the quality of governance? Will it improve governance? In narrow technical sense, there's no reason why it shouldn't, in pure regulatory regimes and so on. It's a fundamental question, I think, that I know that it will probably be discussed later. But I do think that the democracy, does it enhance democracy or not, is I suppose the question. So I think that clearly, just a final comment, that clearly Eurasian integration today is one of those big ideas of our time. I think that I certainly very much welcome today's and other events where we're discussing precisely. Maybe by the end of the day, I will find the answer I'm looking forward to. Is it a good idea or not? Thank you.
Now we can move on to a discussion, and we'll take any questions. Yes, the first one.
Thank you very much. My name is André Gerrits. I'm from Leiden University. Well, we discussed quite a bit across time, across space. So I'm slightly confused, but then again, this is the first session of the day. So let me focus or direct my question to Ray's presentation. Well, we already mentioned Putin as an organic intellectual, so leave that aside. But my question relates to it. I mean, why do we take them so seriously? For example, if you take your last quote from the foreign policy concept, if you carefully read it, it makes no sense at all. It's total nonsense. My point here is, can we simply use terms like civilization and use them seriously, use them in a way they are being used by our objects of research? can we really discuss these kind of issues in terms of civilization? Now you seem to be a bit uncertain yourself because you refer to civilization, but you also refer to a project of political identity. You see it as an attempt, as a sort of a counter-hegemonic exercise, as an attempt to legitimize the domestic political order. Well, if you take all these things together, you basically have everything. So should we be slightly sharper in a way, intellectually sharper? And then my second question, which is related to should we and in what way should we use these kind of concepts, are the two things which you did not mention in your presentation. They might be in your paper, I don't think so. They were mentioned by the other two excellent speakers. One is China. What's the role, the place, the function of China in this current Eurasianism? And the second issue, which none of the speakers mentioned, is Russian nationalism. As Peter said, these kind of projects do not go well with the Russian population or words of that kind. So what is the link between all this Eurasianism stuff and, let's say, the regime's concept of the Russian national interest, if not of Russian nationalism? Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. I think we'll have a few questions together, as we only have about just over 15 minutes. So would you like to?
Okay, thanks. I have less grander construction of. Was one question is to all the speakers that in conceptualizing, we notice that there's a strong ontological emphasis on how one engages with the notion of Eurasianism and all the other machinery of it. But looking at the machinery of it, I think one key point that still needs to be looked at more deeply is the industrial policy in this space. The broken system and the will to re-emphasize that particular idea of moving from a production mechanism to a commodities-driven thing, and almost an embarrassment of it at the level of Russian and other states, while celebration of it in other parts of the space and so on, and how that links up again to China and Europe. So that's sort of more of a question, and I have a minor comment, Ray, particularly to you. It's a question of how you develop the semantics of the story. So it's quite interesting that when you're looking at the early discussion of Eurasianism and the philosophical backing of it, the word West seeps in the discourse. And I wonder how could that happen, because looking back then we don't have the same construction of the world orders, and the word West doesn't exist. Perhaps there is a way in when we look discussing church. That's where that division, separation does come in. And equally, the word, in more modern context, the liberal. And that starts to become relabeled very much as a hegemonic thing. So it actually means quite differently linguistically as versus how it's used in that context. So just stop there.
Thank you. Elena, Professor of the University of Kent. Thank you very much to all the speakers, very interesting presentation. But I would like to focus perhaps on Ray's presentation, you were first. And I would like to come back to your notion of embedded civilizationalism, because I found it particularly interesting, especially the way you put it into the wider neoliberal context, and obviously which opens up a wider debate, as you alluded to at the beginning, to the discussion of counter-world order. So my question here would be whether what you've kind of adopted for your discussion could be potentially limiting for what is currently emerging as the new phenomenon, Eurasia phenomenon. Because after all, what essentially, yet again on the discourse level, the Eurasia project often is referred to by the political leaders, is for it to be actually having different values, but necessarily be the hub or that kind of link perhaps between Europe and Asia Pacific. But if it is viewed within your approach as embedded civilizationalism, then it would have a very limited place in indeed a counter counter option to the world order. So it is not really the way to bed into the existing and perhaps future international order. And very often, as you know, the regionalism and all this regional project it's their way into the international system. So would you please perhaps a little bit more?
Okay, well I think at this stage we can have some response from the panel, and then if there's time we'll have another round of questions.
Okay, thank you all for fantastic questions. I'm going to try to deal with them maybe in reverse order, but speak to them all in various ways almost simultaneously. So the last question is in fact a very good one, and I think it's something that I've struggled with in many respects in trying to grasp Eurasianist developments from this perspective of world order. And in fact, you're absolutely correct. I think at times I've perhaps misused this term counter-hegemonic because in some respects it's not that, insofar as it does not portend the capacity to transform the global system in any sort of meaningful way. And it might actually, Richard's term neo-revisionism might in fact better encapsulate it in terms of what sort of aspirations are represented by Eurasian integration. But in terms of sort of, in other words, I relate this to a broader multipolarization of the world order. And Eurasianism and civilizationalism are part and parcel of a whole host of, if we can call them, practices and legitimizing discourses around the notion of state capitalism and around the notion of the inherent cultural integrity of alternative development models. Those alternative development models which are in fact very top-heavy with what we might refer to as authoritarian governments. So this in its own way is an attempt to shift predominantly American, generally Western hegemonic ideals of a liberal nature and the corresponding sort of methods of governance, methods of democracy promotion, methods of cultural legitimation of another type. So insofar as they're engaging with those ideas on a number of levels, it represents a particular form of counter-hegemony, but one that arguably has limitations in terms of its ability to transform systems. And I think on a related level, the first question about whether or not we should take civilizations seriously is very much part and parcel of that question. And it's actually representative of something that I've struggled with a bit in terms of this research. And ontologically, what is a civilization? I mean, can we even actually reasonably encapsulate that? And I don't know that I can, quite frankly. And so as a result, my analytical foray into this material has been largely at the discursive level. So I have my doubts as to whether or not contemporary iterations of Russian statecraft are somehow representative of this civilizational propensity, this Mongol autocratic propensity that has almost a deeply DNA type embeddedness in Russian national character. I have my doubts of that. But one thing that can be tangibly focused on in the current conjuncture is the manner by which Russian state officials utilize that discourse for their own purposes of legitimation and for providing the sort of ideological shell of what are otherwise very material sort of initiatives. So I don't know how far I want to go down that train of knowing what civilizations are or not, but it's a particularly valid question. And yes, I did not speak in particular about China and Russian nationalism in this paper. And this, of course, both prominent phenomena actually represent a series of wrinkles for the Eurasianist project along the lines that we've sort of demarcated here today, in that they don't fit with that in any sort of narrow or explicit sense. And here's where I see Eurasianism in the context of Eurasian integration as a necessary sort of ideological foray on the part of the Russian government, in that and here's where my materialism shows through, is that there are extant realities with respects to demographic issues, with respects to the changing calculus of ethnicities within Russia. there is a very much an imperative to consolidate Eurasian space for the purposes of technological and economic modernization. So for one way or another, this has been deemed necessary on the part of Russian elites. And in order to then legitimate that, one can't borrow selectively from the language of purely Russian nationalism, because it simply doesn't work. And to do so would be insufficient for the purposes of consolidating Eurasian space under Russian leadership. So it's a very tenuous sort of game they're playing, in that, on the one hand, what Eurasianism as a philosophical discourse offers is the prolonged hegemony of Russian nationalism on the Eurasian plains, but in a manner that is more harmonious with external populations. So it's a way of sneaking in certain aspects of Russian nationalism, but in a more cosmopolitan guise. China is another very big question that I don't know if I have time to speak to right now, and I'd like to pass it over to my panel mates here too.
Go ahead, yeah. Yes, thank you. First of all, Russian nationalism. My book, Russian Messianism, self-advertisement, sorry, came out in 2000. I argued that there were at least two conceptually quite distinct types of Russian nationalism. One of which was based on the state, which I think today is more usually called statism, and one based on the Russian people, the ethnic Russian people. And the two are very often in opposition, right from the time of Muscovy. The ideology of Moscow the Third Rome was counterposed, which was an imperial ideology, was a Tsarist ideology, was counterposed by the idea of Holy Rus, which is the people, the chosen people, as opposed to the chosen Tsar. And this we see this conflict exactly today with Putin's statism, which, as I said, cannot restrict itself to ethnic Russians because they're a declining part of the population. So it has to bring in something like Eurasianism as opposed to ethnic Russian nationalism on the one hand. And on the other hand, the ethnic Russian nationalism that wants to stop any foreigners from coming and taking all the jobs. Moving on to industrial policy, your question at the front. This is very interesting. What the Eurasian integration projects mean for industrial policy. I'm sorry, I didn't have a time to mention it at all. A very important point to make, I think, is that the common economic space, it was sold to Kazakhstan on the basis that the rules will be entirely compatible with those of the World Trade Organization. Because we have this strange situation where Russia is in the World Trade Organization and Belarus and Kazakhstan are not at the moment. Although Kyrgyzstan, paradoxically, went in a long time ago, 98. But, and so the rules of industrial policy, actually those set by the World Trade Organization, which places quite clear limits on what the state can do and what the state can't do. That's the most important to make about industrial policy. Beyond that, including in industry the concept of energy industry. I don't think you just meant manufacturing industry when you said industry. Well, it means other things as well. And energy is, I do mention this in the written paper, is an important stimulus for the desire for Eurasian integration on the part of Putin, because the state-controlled and also the privately owned oil companies, to say nothing of Gazprom, would like to have as much control as possible over the raw material resources and over the pipelines that exist within the former Soviet Union as a whole, and that Western companies and Chinese companies, for that matter, have less access. One also should mention that in some industries, the countries are clearly in competition. Russian coal, back to energy again, Russian coal is from Siberia, is in competition with Ukrainian coal from the Donbass. So there are problems there. Sorry? Ukrainian coal from the Donbass, yes. Yeah, is that right?
I think we're going to talk about Kazakhstan. Go ahead.
No, I don't know about coal in Kazakhstan. Karaganda. So, well, it's a good point. They're all in competition. I don't need to talk. You all know it already. But the other issue that for industrial policy is the whole question of innovation, reducing the dependence of Russia in particular on energy. Now, I'm very sceptical about the possibilities of diversification in the context of the present political regime, where you have what I would call a predatory state in Russia, which, whenever it sees any new business, new industry developing, the bureaucrats, the Siloviki, their friends, want to get in there and stifle initiative. That is the real reason why it's been so hard to diversify the Russian economy. This is why, after decades of the Russian leadership talking about diversification, in fact, it's about as dependent on oil and gas as it has been, even in Soviet times. As far as in terms of science and technology, what I think Moscow would like, it were not for the fact of the predatory state, and even with it, Moscow would like to concentrate the intellectual and scientific resources of the whole of post-Soviet space in Moscow. That was the model of the Academy of Sciences, the USSR, and of similar bodies. Russia, I think, would like to do that. Skolkovo was a sort of, although it was focused on the Russian state, in fact, there was always the idea to attract in foreign participation, and while the emphasis in Western coverage was on bringing people from America, at the same time there was an idea to have the intelligent Armenians, Azerbaijanis and Kazakhs there as well. On China, I'm sorry I couldn't deal with that at all already in the paper, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization represents several things. On the one hand, it represents the desire of Russia and China to ensure that they don't have any misunderstandings that lead to war. I mean, it's still in the memory, the clashes of 1969 on the Ussuri River. So, a set of confidence-building measures, cooperation in economic and security fields, cooperation above all against terrorism, against Al-Qaeda and its derivatives, all that central to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Beyond that, especially in Central Asia, which is the focus of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, one has to recognize that despite the strategic partnership between Russia and China are in competition. And the essential agreement, as far as I can see, is that Russia is prepared to allow, partly because it can't stop, Chinese economic involvement in Central Asia, so long as China does not involve itself in the security of Central Asia. Russia was quite concerned at different times about the American bases in Central Asia. It would have been far more concerned if there had been a single Chinese base in Central Asia. That is the level of the competition. Even at the strategic level between Russia and China, it's clear that while Russia welcomes Chinese support on issues relating to the Middle East, Russia has not been willing to cooperate with the recent Chinese more assertive roles in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Rather, instead of backing China's extension of its maritime territory, I've got the right term, sorry, rather Russia has been trying, where America has been clearly backing Japan on the one hand and Taiwan, rather Russia has been saying to all parties, calm down, we don't want a conflict, because Russia fears above all a conflict between China and the United States that would be bitterly disruptive to itself. Thank you.
Well, I think what we could do here is we only 5 minutes left. We will save Richard until the very end, and we've two people who want to ask some questions. Perhaps they could do their questions, and then maybe you could just finish off. So I saw the lady at the back there, I think, and there's somebody here in the middle. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Speak up.
Thank you very much. Katarina Wolfric from the University of Birmingham. I've got a question to Richard, really, and reconciling different parts of your argument. In terms of normalization, regionalism as entering sort of the world of regions versus this neo-revisionist and counter-hegemonic project. Either it's normalization or challenging something. And I've just come up with the argument, you know, the benchmark for assessing is Eurasianism good. We've got a number of benchmarks. And in my view, and so this work we've done in Birmingham, we see Eurasian project as moving Russia especially to a new domain where it has been absent conspicuously over the last 2 decades, basically as a sort of governance project in terms of developing an array of technical norms in which the EU has specialized so far. So it's not really challenging Eurovisionists as such, it's really developing a new expertise, new domain of which allows Russia to speak as basically as a global power in that respect, have a voice in terms of rule-making on the international arena. And I was quite, the second question is much, so comment is much quicker. You mentioned that the EU criticized Eurasians or post-Soviet integration. I wonder if you could sort of say something about it, because it really seems that it's for the latest phase of Eurasian integration that sort of criticism. Before that, like many other policymakers and scholars, the CIS region has been largely sort of ignored or even criticized for not doing regional integration properly. So I'm not sure if the EU, was so critical, and if anything, it seems to be highly supportive of such, for example, schemes as the CIS-wide free trade agreement, which was adopted in 2011. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
And the other lady? Is there anyone else wants to make a point? Okay, go ahead.
I'm Marina Filova-Walker from the music faculty just down the road, and I was very grateful to Ray for explaining how these sort of rather kooky ideas of Suchinsky and Trubetskoy sort of, are relevant to the current situation. But my question might be a bit premature, but I still think that we should look at the things straight away, both ways, from the center to the periphery and from the periphery to the center. And in this case, when you were talking about the architects of the contemporary Eurasianism, you didn't actually mention Nazarbayev, I think. And I'm wondering, because the Kazakhs are going to celebrate, I think, 20 years of his project this year. And I was wondering whether we were talking about the same thing, whether he was in fact one of the first people to, or are they completely different?
Okay, well, Richard, would you like to respond to the earlier questions and this one, and then we'll have to pack up?
Yeah, thanks. Just one very quick comment on Russian nationalism. The bottom line is, I think that despite the nuances which were mentioned, bottom line, Russian ethnic or nationalism was always opposed to Eurasianism. These are two different things, and very sharply so. But what's been peculiar in the last 10 years or so is that type of reconciliation, and that, I think, in intellectual terms, is, I wouldn't go so far as others would go, but nevertheless, it is a type of reconciliation, but the contradictions remain. And I'd even go further to say is that in some ways you could say that the Eurasian project is a way of the Putin regime to constrain the mobilization of Russian nationalism as an autonomous force, which it has always considered the most dangerous and threatening to its own hegemony and its own ideas. So it's, that's the bottom line. So that's obviously a sort of important element. The second thing about normalization versus neo-revisionism, that's why I use the word neo, of course. So if I'd said it was revisionist, absolutely, but neo, it tries to run with the hounds and ride with the horses, whatever. So it's exactly that. But what you do, it is that. But if you're talking about Eurasian integration as a governance project, which I think absolutely is very legitimate, and I think a huge amount of good work done on that. However, so therefore that does fit into the Bickerton idea about the European Union as a project of state transformation, and that in a sense you could say Eurasian integration is also that. In other words, that it is an attempt to establish its own normative values, and therefore, as you say, these normative standards which were which are simply the technical and regulatory frameworks which were inherited from the Soviet Union. Clearly, you need to reboot it because 20 years have passed and the whole thing has changed, and therefore, at all levels, but more broadly, not just phytosanitary, but deeply in terms of the legal stuff and everything else. So you're absolutely right. In other words, that Eurasian integration is forcing, if you like, if we can put it more simply, a type of state modernization. It's actually a booting up from outside because of what I would say, the blockage in modernization and the political impasse internal to the Russian regime today. And that Eurasian integration, again, is another way of feeding in, as, if you like, an energy and forces entering into global projects, and the WTO is absolutely crucial, that element, the fact that it's compatible with acquis communautaire, it's compatible with the World Trade Organization. It's quite explicit. In other words, it's not retrogressive, not a backward-looking, not an autarkic, neo-autarkic, I think you're absolutely right. No, I mean, that's an important way of looking at it. However, that may well be intent, but the project, of course, as Peter alluded to, that ultimately, if you're going to establish this element, will there not Mongol Muscovite forms of statecraft sneak in, if not through the front door, then through the back door? So clearly, I mean, this is where you do have to look at the factionalism within the Kremlin. I mean, this Eurasianist factions, Primakov, Glaziev, Stankiewicz, earlier, and so on, are only one. And as always, in Putinite system, there are counter-factions quite strongly. So the pro-Europeanist, the pro-Chinese, all sorts of things. So there's the embeddedness is that the key point is, that traditional and other intellectuals. There's an enormous amount of traditional intellectuals outside of the organic side, if you to use Gay's terms. And the public sphere, the debate is enormous and contested and so on going on at the moment. So nothing, and the whole point about, you could say about Putinism, is that it never achieves embedment. That's the whole point. That it's constantly superficial, polymorphous, and you can't, this is why we can't put our finger on it by definition, because it doesn't want, and that is the essence of a statecraft, not to tie himself down. And this is what's different. You could say about Eurasian integration, finally he's put his cards on the table for almost one of the first times, while keeping the other cards still in play, as always with him. So, as for the European Union attitude towards it, well, we could look at all the detail and so on. You're absolutely right. However, I would take a very critical view that ultimately, European Union, there has been, you're quite right for CS, and it's criticised, it hasn't gone far enough. But as soon as it does go a bit further, it's criticised. So in other words, it was complaining about something that it knew wasn't actually happening. But as soon as seriously, the point about European Union is that it has tried to appropriate its vision, the progressive vision, what it means to be European. I mean, as simple as that. And it has failed to enunciate what was quite clearly required was a vision of what it means to be a common European after the end of communism. It's simple as that. And in other words, the project of what I call a very narrow project of 1989, that is East European, Hungary, Poland, European Union, in one side, was claimed to be dominant. You have another Eurasianism, this Eurasian integration today is a project of 1991 for the post-Soviet space. In between, you have the project of 1990, which has been given no epistemological status whatsoever, either by the East or the West. Hence you have this unseemly, undignified and catastrophic tug of war at the moment. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you.